am Jan Knight, and my company is Bancroft Information Services. What I end up doing most of the time is working with a lot of startup companies. I help them determine who their market is, who their competitors are, how they fit into the industry. So today I'm going to talk to you about market research and a little bit about me and why I'm doing this with you today is I am an independent, and a lot of people like to have independent consultants work on their research for them so it doesn't look as if it's something they've just come up with to fit their plan. I help companies quite often when they're writing their business plans. I do the research for their marketing plans and their business development. And my clients range from startups as well as to established companies, because often when established companies are putting out new products or services, they go through the same process as they do when they're putting together a new company. Okay, and what I'm going to cover today is market research in general. So we'll talk a little bit about primary versus secondary so that you have a better feel for what those two things are, how they fit into your planning. I'm going to talk a little bit about some planning and strategies for you to do with your own research, give examples of primary research, and most of my work is actually secondary market research. So while I will talk about the other, what I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on most of the time is talking to you about secondary market research. That's also the kind of thing that you do yourself. And we'll give you some tips and some resources, as well as some strategies. So as a Market Research 101, gathering, recording, and analyzing information about your business. And that's really a very generic type of description, but think of it this way, that when you can make better informed decisions, you're going to be more successful. So research really matters. And market research is not marketing. Something to keep in mind when you're working on marketing. You can use market research as a background here, but it's not the same as marketing. Marketing is what you do with the information once you have gathered it. So the types of things that people do market research for range from business plans and marketing plans, product development and looking for funding, and all of you in a startup mode will be familiar with those things. And if you think of the kinds of information that you often need to write a business plan, for example, you have industry information. Who are your key players? How is it segmented? How is that industry segmented? What are the statistics and trends in that industry? Another key area is competitors. A lot of people think they don't have competitors. In fact, in my work, quite often, I am asked to find competitors and find information about them. So competitors, the services and products that they offer, how they sell their product, how they market and distribute. The market potential, a really key area that you'll be needing to find information on, is how big is your market and who is your market? Is there really somebody to sell this to, whatever this is? Is it something that you're helping solve a problem with? What are these customers and clients? What is their problem that you're solving? Market drivers, what's leading the market? What's helping this particular product or service become useful to them? And I even include executive and company searching under market research. Basically, market research in this term is a high-level term for me, and it really includes anything that you want to know in order to make better informed decisions. So again, we'll go back to the topic of primary research. This is the kind of thing that people think of when you talk about market research. It's data collected from an original source, primary source. And that primary source could be your customers, your potential clients, it could be your employees, it could be anybody, but it's an original source. And typically it's information collected for a specific purpose. So here I give the example of it's to determine if your current customers are happy with a service. It also could be information that you're trying to glean to determine is a new service that you want to offer, something that they might be interested in. Primary research, qualitative versus quantitative. And many of you probably are familiar with focus groups and in-depth interviews. And that's a qualitative type of research. It's not based on measurable input. So basically you have a few people, if you're talking about a focus group, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, it's an area of input where the opinions are really not projectable to a larger population. Quantitative, on the other hand, surveys, this has hard facts, opinions, and those are representative or can be representative and projectable to a larger population. So to talk a little bit more about focus groups. A focus group is made up of a homogeneous group. Basically, you can get some spontaneous input from those people. Input can be redirected, And it really is a forum where you can stimulate some new ideas. And when you have a really good moderator, you really need a good moderator, it can help to stimulate interaction. Cons, there are recruiting issues with focus groups. There are incentives that you have to pay quite often, and it's well known that doctors, for example, when they're being asked to be part of a focus group, have to be paid a fairly large incentive. A good time to use a focus group is when you need to share some information about something, especially if you have an object, a new product, a prototype maybe to share. I have a great story of a medical device prototype. There was a medical device that had been created by some engineers and some doctors, and they decided to hold a focus group with nurses. Nurses were the population who would be using this. What they did was they put the prototype for this device in the hands of the people at the focus group, and the women immediately, nurses are mostly women, not solely, but they were in this group, immediately determined that this would not work for them. This device that they had a trigger on was just too big for their hands. Their hands were smaller. This was something that had this particular company not had a focus group, they would not have determined, at least not so easily. Another area of primary research is surveys. You can have mail surveys, phone surveys, and email surveys. And now, of course, new technologies, smartphone surveys and such. Mail surveys afford you to put longer, complicated questions to people. And you could show a product maybe in a picture. But you can imagine that that can be kind of expensive with mailing. It takes people's time. You've really got to get some buying on that. Phone surveys, you obviously can control the sample of respondents. You can call enough people, you can just keep calling until you get enough people for your sample, but it's obviously an area where you cannot show a product and people will only give you so much time on the telephone. Email surveys, pretty quick turnaround, less expensive, and nowadays, of course, people are using web and mobile surveys. So there are a number of ways that people can be surveyed, and again, this is quantitative, and you can, if you get the right amount of people in a sample, you can use this data and extrapolate to a larger population. But on all surveys, the response rate can be low and slow. You need a good list of people to select from. For example, on the email surveys, it's really difficult to get email lists. As you know, it can be costly. On the other hand, sometimes it's almost impossible to get email addresses. Sometimes if you belong to a trade association, they will let you email their membership, maybe as long as they can keep a copy of the results of your survey. So now I want to talk about secondary research. This is the area that I work on in my business, and it's also called desk research in the UK and Europe. It's basically accessing information and data that's previously been collected, but it's often been collected for a different purpose. By that I mean you may have a survey that is published, and it may have been put together by HP for printers. You may be selling cartridges, for example, and that data might very well be useful to you, even though the original survey was for a different reason. It's often a good precursor to primary research, and I say that because often if you're going to do an in-depth interview with an individual in the industry, then it's really good to have some background research, and that's where the secondary research comes in to be really handy. It comes in very handy to have information about the trends, the segmentation, what's happening in the industry, so that you can address those maybe with your focus group people, your survey, or your interview. It really does kind of provide a picture of what's happening nationally and internationally. Basically, secondary research is, again, it's the information that's previously been collected. So you find it in things like articles and studies. It can be newspaper articles, magazine articles, popular press, business articles, and company databases. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those. So factors determining costs. I put this in because a lot of people, if they've not done any sort of research, especially startups, the only research they've done is they've jumped on the internet and done their own, or they've talked to family members or potential customers. So to use people who actually provide these services or to do it yourself, you should be aware that if you're doing secondary research, obviously the more mature an industry is, there's more information that's been written about it. With new and niche industries, they've not been studied as much, so therefore there's less information, and that makes sense. People haven't written about them, there's been no money maybe invested in research. So secondary research is less expensive than primary research, but you really do have to pay if you want some robust data. You can use some fee-based databases, which I'll talk about. And turnaround time makes a difference. If you want something in a few days, either you're going to take your own time or you're going to pay somebody to do it more quickly. Primary research. Factors determining cost, obviously in focus groups, would depend how many focus groups you're having, how many people, whether you have them in different locations around the country. The cost of the incentives. I mentioned earlier that doctors are a well-known group for needing incentives. If you're doing interviews, do you have to fly out there and do an in-person interview, or can you do a phone interview? With surveys, you have to determine how many questions are there, how many respondents, who's writing the questions. It's kind of a cross between science and art to write a good market research survey. And then what type of analysis do you want? Are you doing the analysis yourself, or is the market research company tabulating and reporting as needed? So all of these things are important when you're determining what type of research you need to do and when and how much it will cost. So talking strategies about secondary research, one of the key things I would suggest you do, first of all, one of my key things I tell people is don't just jump on Google. Don't just type words in. Think about who else would have commissioned a study on what you want to know. Who has the money to pay for such studies? Maybe a large corporation does, maybe a nonprofit does, or at least they have the need, if not always the money. Maybe a funder does, somebody who's got some money who wants to fund the industry. What conferences might focus on the topic? Because that's where the articles might have been discussed. They may have been published. Think about who are the experts in that industry. Who might write about this? They could be journalists. They could be industry analysts and authors. And one of the things I suggest is if you find somebody that you see their name coming up again and again about a particular topic or an industry, make note of it, Google them, and then, or some other search engine, find information about them. They often have their own website. And I have found it very useful sometimes to contact that person individually, even if they're journalists for a newspaper or a magazine, and ask them if they have additional information. So think about your own industry and the specific sources that the data that you need might be published in, and just how available it might be. One of the things I want to mention to all of you is the fact that there are subscription databases that exist, and you'll see the $4 signs. Some of these databases are very expensive. Some are available to large companies. I subscribe to some of these as an independent researcher myself. If you're in a startup mode, you probably don't have access to these. Most universities and some business libraries and occasionally some public libraries have access to some of these databases, maybe in an abbreviated form. So it's really important that you are aware that these databases exist. It's not that you're going to run out and get them, but you probably already know Hoover's, for example. A lot of people do. It's a hybrid type of resource, which means some of it is free. And then just when you get to the good part, you have to pay, or you have to get a registration and pay. And others of these, you have to pay for the whole registration. So some are not cheap. And they also have very different algorithms for searching. So most of them are used by professional librarians or researchers, such as myself. And occasionally businesses will purchase a couple of databases that they know are valuable to their own particular industry. But in general, these are more professionally used. But just know that they exist because the information is really robust. So as far as search strategies, a lot of what I'm going to talk about does involve the internet because that's mostly what probably you'll have access to. So think about what do you know already. Some of this may seem really simplistic, but the truth is I've had people who have written to me after presentations and said one of the most useful pieces of a presentation is reminding them that they should put a strategy together rather than just jumping on the internet. So what do you know already? Think about what the gaps are in your information. You really need a goal so that you know what you're looking for. So creating a source list, you have publications, you have articles, you might have other people that you want to talk to, but write them down. And don't just Google it. And by that I mean don't just use Google. There have been some studies that show that people use Google most of the time, and the problems with that is there are some searches that maybe only a third of the information in one database, one search engine, is available in another. So there's not always a lot of crossover. So use some other search engines in addition to Google. And use some of the tools that I'm going to talk about in this presentation. Think about the keywords and phrases that you might use that are really important, not only to your industry, but are often used in the way reports are written. And I'll give you some examples of that in a minute. My suggestion is you start this process with opening a Word document. You throw in those sources, you put in your keywords and phrases, You then put in your results as you're going through the internet. Make sure when you put a URL in there or a website that you write why you're putting that in there, because believe me, you won't remember in a few days or a few weeks why you thought that website was useful. If you talk to experts, put down the contact information right there and then in that document. Put down as much as you can about what they said. You kind of have to know when to stop. Now, the little graphic here really is this is an iterative process. So you have to know when to stop. And people have asked me, how do you know when to stop? Well, if you're on the internet and you're using a search engine, if you keep coming up with the same data again and again, the same sources again and again, then pretty much you know to stop. Analyze your information and maybe move on and use some different keywords and phrases. So these are some phrases that I strongly suggest you use. A lot of very expensive market research reports, but very useful reports, have these types of headings. Market share, market data. You can imagine that if you pair some of these things with your own topic, you could find lots of information. So you could pair the phrase, for example, market trends with something like biotechnology. You could pair almost any of these with a particular industry. And the reason these phrases are very useful, when you do look at a couple of market research reports, you'll see that these are often headings. So when you're using a search engine, think about how it works. It needs to find the words that you're looking for. So one of the first sources I would go to is market research reports. The problem with this is they're usually very expensive. Most of my clients and most of you probably don't want to spend the money that they cost, and they cost anywhere between $500 and $6,000. But there are some ways around it. Often, market research companies will provide you with an abstract. That abstract may have enough information for your use. Sometimes you'll find that if you Google the title of a market research report that you found, somebody else has written about it and referenced it. That's the cheapest way to get it. Sometimes companies will actually sell you a slice, and by a slice I mean maybe a page of data or a chapter or a few pages. Often market research companies will provide you with slices if the data is a little bit older. So if they've put out a new publication in the current year, they might sell the old one off in slices if you ask them. So pick up the phone and ask. So finding market research reports, my first go-to resource is marketresearch.com. You have to register, but it's free. What they are is they are an aggregator of a number of different market research companies, and they sell reports from a number of companies. And in this interface, you can usually look at the table of contents. You can often look at the abstract or the summary. You can often search for a word. Won't tell you what the data is on that page until you pay, but you can do all of those things. And then there are other market research companies who focus on particular industries, maybe technology. Some of you are probably familiar with Gartner and technology and Frost and Sullivan in the biotech fields and such. And there are many more. A second source is newspapers and business magazines. And I have a phrase here, big fish in a little pond. What I mean by that is you might have in your town, here in Tucson, Arizona, we have a businessman called Jim Click, sells cars. Jim Click is kind of a big fish in Tucson. It is much more likely to find an article about Jim Click and his business in a Tucson newspaper than it is the New York Times, for example. And I give the example here of the Phoenix Business Journal. Maybe a solar company in Phoenix might be written about in the Phoenix Business Journal, but not talked about in the New York Times or Wall Street Journal. So people often, when they're interviewed for a local business story, give away a lot of information. And I've often found this useful when looking for competitive information for my clients. So if my client has a competitor in another city, another state, I'll look for the newspapers in that city and state and see if I can find any stories about their competitors. People give away a lot of information because they're excited to be in the press. There are a number of ways to find news, but I'm giving you a couple of resources. The first one, onlinenewspapers.com, is a resource that you can pretty much find any state in any city and look for the newspapers, and it takes you straight to the online version. And I believe they have international newspapers there, but there are others that you can Google and find. Business Journals is a great resource for different cities, and you can actually subscribe to different business journals in different cities and for different topics. And then, of course, there is Google News, and that will give you current news. Another great resource that everybody should be aware of is the industry and trade associations that are associated with their business or their client's business. So as most of you probably know, a trade association is a membership of professionals in a field. Often trade associations will commission research and studies. And they'll share those results of those studies with you as a member. Memberships can vary in price, obviously, and I'm sure you're familiar with engineering associations. I belong to a trade association for information professionals. There are biotechnology, there are technology council associations, and they usually have a national association, they usually have statewide associations, sometimes city. But you really should know what your own trade association is, or maybe the ones that your clients, your potential clients, belong to. And this group of people as members really are often professionals in a particular field, and you share a lot of interests. So again, you often have a trade journal associated with a trade association. It's one of the first places I look for information for competitors, how people are selling their product. So do you belong to a trade association? If you don't currently, you really should. And one of the couple of ways to find it is through Marketing Source or the Internet Public Library. You can also just Google Trade Association or National Association of and put in what the topic is. That's useful too. One of the things that sometimes trade associations allow you to do is to put together a survey of your own, and they will email it to their membership. Often they want to share the data with you, but it's a great opportunity to survey a group of people that you want to. Another source, trade shows and conferences. One of the things I do when I'm doing a competitive research project or when I'm looking at a potential industry is I look at the program. I don't even attend the conference or the trade show, but I go online, I look at the online program, and I look at who is speaking. One of the things that does for me is it gives me experts' names. So people are often asked to speak at trade shows. You can assume they're probably experts or well-known in their field. Look at the topics that those people discuss, and you can often discern trends and issues that are important, especially when you have tracks. Take note of the names of the experts. Maybe Google them, maybe find where they work. Take note of the topics. Maybe talk to those people who were presenting. Follow up, even if you didn't attend. You could write to them, you could call them and say that you missed their presentation, but you have some questions for them. Or maybe they can help you find some information. One of the things you can do is you can look and see who's exhibiting, who's paying to sponsor, and you know that those people, those companies who are doing that are trying to reach their target market. And these could be competitors of yours. So if your competitor is exhibiting or sponsoring at a particular conference, you know that there's a reason that they are, and you might want to be there too. So I use the phrase, hang out where your clients hang out, or hang out where your customers hang out. Whatever it is that you're trying to reach, whatever you're researching, it could be your competitors, it could be potential collaborators and partners to your project. You may need somebody to manufacture your product. You may need somebody to market it. Finding trade shows is pretty easy. One of the great resources is Trade Show News Network, and here you can search by topic, you can search by geography or industry. Blogs and social media. This I'll talk about very briefly, but there is a lot of information, as we all know, out there in social media, and people are posting a lot to social media that they might not post otherwise. So you do have to be careful about who's posting and why. You have to realize some of the reviews for products maybe aren't necessarily real. They may be from the company themselves. They may be fake. But a statistic that is reliable from Quirk's market research is that only 4%, and 4% is a pretty good rate, but only 4% of unhappy customers will provide feedback on an official survey. But 52% of buyers will likely post a product review on a blog or an online forum. And you've probably seen those with trips and such. It's one of the more common, or electronics. So know that people are online, especially if your target market are the kind of people who are online a lot. You can also look for individuals' pages. So if you find a Facebook page on a company, maybe look and see who the owner is. Try and look on Facebook or LinkedIn and other social media and see what's going on with that particular person. You can maybe see who they support, not necessarily politically, but maybe what kinds of charities they support and organizations, and it might give you a feel for that type of person. And the reason you might be looking for people is you may be planning to collaborate with that company. You may see them as a competitor, and there might be some information that would be valuable to you. And ways of finding blogs right here, we have Google Blog Search, Blog Search Engine, and Technorati. Those are 2 or 3 different ones that are pretty good, and there are other ways too. Government websites are a very authoritative type of resource. Since 9/11, some of the resources have been, I would say, hidden a little bit, or they have been diluted a touch, but things are coming back now a little bit. One of the government sources that's really widely used is the census. It has some problems, and in fact, it's hard to dig into. It has problems sometimes if you're a few years away from when the data was collected, but there's still some really good data on international and national information as far as economics. People tend to think the census is just people information, private information, population, salary, how many people live in a house, and all of that is there, but there's a lot of good trade and economic data through the census. So census.gov is one of my go-to sources for that. Bureau of Labor Statistics is a great one. They talk about work, numbers of people in a certain industry, if you're looking at market data, market size. FirstGov is a general resource. And Google has its own search engine for government information called google.com/Uncle Sam. And that's almost like an aggregator, will give you a different perspective on different government sites. It's very handy. Another source that people have asked me about is Wikipedia. And I put here the question, can you really trust Wikipedia? My answer is no, but you can use it, and you can use it wisely. So a lot of people aren't aware that what Wikipedia is a community-based resource. Basically anyone can edit, and a lot of you've probably heard stories of politicians going in and reconstructing the truth. And I will admit that even in my professional work, I sometimes jump on Wikipedia just to get a feel for a topic. If there's a topic you don't know anything about, I would suggest you could go here. But my suggestion is you scan the document itself, you scan the input, and then you move down to the bottom and you look at the resources and citations. To VCs or people funding your venture, I would never cite Wikipedia, but I might well cite a source that I found within Wikipedia. Public companies, those traded on the stock exchange, are much easier to find information on. For example, they have to have full disclosure, so they do have to provide filings to the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. They have annual reports, quarterly reports, lots of reports that are publicly available, and almost anybody can find those through any search engine. There are some databases that provide that information more easily, but anybody can find them, even to the point where sometimes there are agreements with employees and vendors on those sites. However, private companies, much harder to find information, but often you still can. Hoover's, the resource I mentioned earlier, Hoover's is a resource that does include information on private companies. Some of the information given on private companies is a little nebulous. Sometimes it's hard to determine if it's true or not. It's often self-reported. So they're not forced to disclose anything other than to the IRS. And in many cases, your competitors, your collaborators, potential partners are actually private companies. So it's really important that you know there is information out there, but it's a little harder to find. When you are looking at company websites, be aware, obviously, this is at the bottom of the slide, they tell you what they want you to know. You have to be very careful because this is their public site. One of the things I do sometimes when I'm searching for information on a company, I search for PowerPoint presentations only, and I'll have a slide later that talks to you about how to do an advanced search, and you can search by document type. So PowerPoint presentations are great. It's often when a manager or CEO of a company has been asked to speak at an event, they often put their presentation online. And sometimes I think their presentations are on the public side of the site when they should probably be on the private side. I have found presentations with confidential stamped across them within the company website. So you never know what you're going to find. But you can look for press releases, reports. You can look for biographical information on executives. I often find it useful to look at who is the executive, who the C-level executives are, and maybe see where they were before and what they did with those companies that they worked in before. If a CEO or a marketing person is known for doing a certain thing, taking the company in a particular direction, at every company they've worked in, then it's likely they may be considering doing the same thing at a new company. You have to be a little creative in how you look at information from companies. One of the things I do is I like to see how companies brand and differentiate themselves, and this is especially useful in competitive research. Look at employment opportunities that are on the website. This often shows their plans for the future. It's easy to see when people don't have staff right now to cover a particular function and they're hiring. That's really valuable information. Look at what their marketing strategies are. A tip that I've given out that's been valuable to me is occasionally I'll fill in a form on a website in order, let's say, to get a newsletter, to subscribe to a newsletter. And one of the questions they ask me is, how did you hear about us? And they'll put something like journal, conference, TV ad, newspaper, All of those things obviously are now, are now media outlets for them. It's the way they advertise. So again, be a little creative, and you often can tell from a website what the sales and distribution channels are. Now I'm going to move into just a few tips that will help you really try to dig a little deeper into the internet and find what you need a little more quickly. But I'm just going to give you an example of how Boolean logic and advanced search can really help you narrow your results. So here, when I searched on alternative energy as two separate words, without any sort of phrasing, without any sort of quotes, I came up with 51 plus million hits, which is not that useful. When I searched for alternative energy with quotes, I came up with 9 million. It's still pretty high, but it was now only looking and bringing me results that had alternative energy as a phrase. It wasn't looking for alternative in one part of the finding and energy elsewhere. It had to be alternative energy. And then in this particular example, I was looking for alternative energy in wind. I did not want solar. So you can see, use alternative energy as a phrase, have and wind, not solar. I came up with 639,000. So the result of an advanced search, you can see right here how it did it in the advanced search, which in Google, by the way, is just the box right next to the search tool. Search box is a label called advanced search. Click on that, it will take you to a format where you can type in, basically a template. But if you want to do it this way, you can just see right here, wind alternative energy with a minus sign solar. And the results are much more pertinent and focused. And so the first one here is altenergy.org. It's a nonprofit, which is great, Alternative Energy Institute. This one is Alternative Energy News. We have Home Power. And what will happen on these, at least it will give you usually some associations or some key resources in that area. Another tip is Google Alerts. I would suggest you all set up Google Alerts for your own company, for your competitors, for anything in your industry that you really want to keep tabs on. For those of you who don't use Google Alerts currently, what it is a way to push results to your email, so you don't have to go in every day and do a search. So you found a really good Google search that has been successful. You found some results that you like and that are pertinent, and you want to be kept up with new results. So what you do is you do that search in Google. You can do this in other engines also, but I'm using Google in this example. And you save it as an alert. If you don't know how to do that, you can go right down to google.com/alerts, and it will provide you with ways to do that. So once you've set up a Google alert, anytime that particular Google search appears in the top 10 or 20 results of a Google search, it will be pushed to your email. It's one of the key things you can do to make your life easier. Here's a tip that I found to be really useful. There's a website, Archive. It's hit and miss, and I say that because some results are much better than others, but it's still a really good resource to at least try. You can reach it two ways. You can reach it two ways. One is through archive.org. You go to the top of the middle of the page, and you'll see a little box saying Wayback Machine, or you can just actually go to wayback.archive. Well, you can see the website right here. If you're reviewing the growth of a product line, growth of a company, who the executives are, how they're changing, what their marketing strategy is, and corporate branding, it's nice to see over time. It's one thing in a more traditional marketing world to have collected brochures or collected collateral pieces from those companies, but nowadays people use their websites. So you can see how their website was at a certain time. Again, it's hit and miss, but it's something worth trying. So the way you do it is, in this case, the example that I'm just about to show you was the Small Business Administration website as it is now in 2011 and as it was in 2006. This is how it is in 2011. You can see right here they have social media in effect, Facebook and Twitter. Everything's pretty clearly laid out. It allows you to share with the RSS feed. And there's a good search box. It's a pretty clean website. Looks good. But let's say this was a competitor and you wanted to go back and see how many products did they used to have. What was their branding like earlier? What you can do, this is the Wayback Machine. This goes from 2000 to 2008 actually. And it also shows you that in 2000 they had 19 pages, all the way up through 78, 94, all the way at one point to 409 pages. And this is very typical for websites. They grow, they get crazy, people can't find anything anymore. And then they cut them down. So in 2008, it was down to 102 pages. I honestly don't know how many they have right now, but this will give you an idea of how many times they changed. So what you then do is you click on one of these, and it will tell you or give you a picture of what the website looked like at that point. The hit and miss part of this is that some sites, some people have gotten really savvy and they've done things with their sites that don't allow them to be archived. Other times parts of the site will be archived and the in-depth parts or the lower level pages are not. But it still gives you a pretty good idea sometimes, especially as I mentioned with product growth, how many products somebody has now versus what they had a few years ago. So this is, as an example, this is the website back in 2006. So it's not hugely different, but you see there's no social media here. The website is actually not as clean. It's got a number of different areas of navigation. It's just an earlier kind of style. So Wayback Machine is a very useful resource for you to use. Okay, another tip is the reverse link lookup. A lot of people are aware of this, but how do you use it? It's really handy to see how people are identifying themselves with other partnerships, memberships, other companies, clients, and such. So what you do, it's really a way of finding out who is linking to a website. So for the purpose of this, I've used the Arizona Center for Innovation. I've used their website. And what you do is you go to a search engine. It works in many search engines. Again, I'm using Google here. And you type in link, the word link, L-I-N-K, and then the website that you want to look at. You want to see who is linking to this website. What you get is a result that looks like this. And in this particular case, the first item is an item called Funding Your Innovation Through the SBIR Program. And this is a UA News, University of Arizona News story. This is another one. This is business services available through Sararita. This is a GoFunding. This is Arizona Innovative Green Solutions. What this tells you is all of these people have some sort of relationship with AZCI because on these resources within their websites, AZCI is linked. And what it can show me is if they're actually listed with other companies, similar companies, let's say on an online resource like a buyer's guide. And that will give me an insight into finding additional companies that might be considered competitors. So there's a number of reasons this could be useful, but it's called the reverse link lookup. And it's also useful to do for your own website because you can see if people are linking to you that you didn't know about. Okay, so in conclusion, research really does matter. It matters because you need to know certain things about your company or your new venture, your potential company. And it matters because people that you want to get involved in your company, especially funders, they need to be convinced that you know some of the answers to some of these questions, or all the answers to some of these questions. So who your market really is. Do you really know who your market is and how big it is? Do you know how to reach your potential clients and customers? Have you done research to see who those people are, how they like to be reached? Primary research often can help determine how do people make decisions. What are the decision factors? Does your product or service actually solve a problem? You may have a wonderful product, but if people don't really need it or see it as something they need, they're unlikely to buy it. And they certainly probably won't buy it if it's more expensive than the solution they already have that does the job. Who are your competitors? What do they offer? Who do they offer it to? And what are the differentiators of those companies and those competitors? Why are they different and why are you different? That's more important. What is your own differentiation? So by researching your competitors, knowing who your market is, you can say to your potential funders and to anybody working in your company that you know who you're trying to reach and you know how to reach them and you know what they need. Investors really expect you to know these things. Sometimes you're actually just confirming what you know already, but most of the time you're learning a lot of new information. So research really matters. So your assignment, now that we've talked about strategy and sources, key phrases, tips, and the difference between primary and secondary, is to really think about how you can use this in your new venture. So what gaps do you have in the research that you need help with? A lot of times people come to me and I ask them, what do you know already? And I think that's really important. You need to document what you know already. Think about where it might have been published. And then try to put a list together of all the trade associations and conferences that you can think of that are pertinent to your product, your market, your competitors. And then, do you really know who your market is and how to find them? With that research, do you know that now? Is that something that you can identify? And can you put a list together of your competitors and determine what the differentiation is? That's what you should be able to do by the end of your research. And you should really know your own differentiation. What is it that you offer? What's your value proposition that really sets you apart from your competitors? What are the trends in your industry? What are the growth areas, market drivers? What's driving the market? What are the growth areas? Because you need to be in those. You need to know what's growing, where the opportunities are, and who are the key players. Maybe these are people that you can identify with, partner with, collaborate with, or maybe compete with, but you need to be aware at least of who they are. So that's the assignment. Thank you.